Hey everybody, Alex Newman here with the New American Senior Editor, and we are joined today by a very special guest, friend of mine, Dan Lyman. He is the editor-in-chief of BorderHawk.News. If you are at all interested in the immigration, the mass tsunami of migrants that are pouring into the Western world, courtesy of the globalists, you want to check it out. It's BorderHawk.News. He's also the bureau chief for Europe for InfoWars. Dan, thank you so much for being with us.
It's a pleasure to be with you, Alex. And coming from a family of longtime New American readers and John Birch Society supporters, it's definitely such an honor.
Hey, well, we sure appreciate everything that you do, Dan. I've been following your reports for years. You do excellent work. And actually, I've been based in Europe for most of the last 15 years or so, including in Switzerland. I spent 4 years there, and then a lot of time in Sweden and France. I want to start off with the crazy news that just broke this morning. There were at least one, maybe more people beheaded in a church in France. So you're on the ground. You guys are 6 hours ahead of us. What exactly is the status of what's going on in France? What do we know so far?
Yeah, so fitting that we would be speaking about immigration today with the tragedies that have unfolded across France. We just published a report at InfoWars Europe, actually documenting everything that has gone down in the last 48 hours or so. And the vast majority of it has occurred on French soil, but also abroad at French embassies. So earlier today, there was a beheading at a Catholic church in the Notre Dame Basilica in Nice, France, and there was an elderly woman there, as far as I know, who was beheaded. There may have been a second beheading. I know that there are 3 people reportedly who are deceased now after a jihad attack. The attacker was yelling Allahu Akbar throughout the attack, and apparently even after he was medically sedated on the scene after being shot, he continued to chant the phrase, according to the mayor of Nice. Now, in addition to that, just hours later, there was another jihadist attack on French soil in another city. A man brandishing a weapon was trying to attack passersby, and he was shot dead by French police. And concurrently, at the same time, there was an attack at the French embassy in Saudi Arabia. A guard there was stabbed as well. And in addition to those events, there was also an attack at the French embassy in Cyprus. There were protests outside of the French embassy in Moscow. And also, a night before last, Turkish migrants, Turkish Islamists, swarmed the streets of Vienne, France, hunting Armenians, apparently. And the videos are pretty shocking from that as well. So that's a bunch of incredible events that have taken place in France just in the last 48 hours or so.
Wow, unbelievable, Dan. Thank you for that update. And for those who don't have the background, the Turks have been persecuting the Armenians for quite a while. In fact, they tried to exterminate the Christians in Turkey about a century ago. Dan, for those people in America who maybe don't follow European news so closely, tell us a little bit about what it is that ticked off the Islamists so badly that they are now attacking French embassies and beheading French people in the streets. Give us a little bit of background on what's going on there with the publication and the French president and all the rest of it.
Yes, of course, France is one of the most Islamized countries in Europe. Some predict that it will be, could approach half Islamic population in the coming decades. And so recently, obviously, this is a long burning situation that has gone on for many decades in the past as well. But recently, a French teacher was beheaded allegedly by an 18-year-old Chechen Islamist. That was less than 2 weeks ago. And since then, that has really sparked an uprising, huge demonstrations across France, mostly peaceful, of course. The French citizens have really become so concerned about what's happening in their country, and this one really struck home for them. Now, since then, the magazine, the satirical magazine Charlie Hebdo, they published more publications and cartoons that really offended the Islamists. And also the French government has essentially said that they need to really work a lot harder at eradicating Islamism on French soil. And Macron has taken that position. I think it's a little strange given his prior positions, but I sense that Marine Le Pen, who is the most staunch anti-Islamization figure in politics in France, is really gaining ground. And in some polls, she's doing better than Macron for the upcoming election. So I think that he probably senses that he needs to take a more hardline approach. Now, in response to the French government essentially declaring war on Islam on French soil, the Islamic world has declared war on France, and that all ties into what I was explaining, what has happened in recent days here in France. And interestingly enough, today is on the Islamic calendar supposedly the birth date of Muhammad, and they are celebrating that worldwide. And on top of that, the former prime minister of Malaysia has effectively come out and endorsed these attacks on the French, saying that many French should be killed in retaliation for past atrocities supposedly perpetrated by the French in the rest of the world. So we have very prominent figures endorsing Islamic violence and murder on European soil at this point.
Yeah, it's pretty incredible. And, I warned many years ago, Dan, I was based in Stockholm at the time. I warned that the globalists were deliberately importing massive numbers of jihadists. And in fact, it was almost like obvious. They were bombing all these countries, and then they were rolling out the red carpet and saying, hey, we ruined your country. Why don't you guys come live in ours? We'll give you free food and free healthcare and free apartment, and we'll brainwash your kids for free in a government school. And naturally, a lot of people said, hey, that sounds like a good idea. So they started marching to Sweden. They started going to France. They started going to Germany. And the process really accelerated, and it's now at the point where major European cities, the locals are actually the natives are in the minority. You have Germans are a minority in Frankfurt, Brits are a minority in London, in Sweden, in Malmo, Swedes are in the minority in one of their largest cities. What do you think is the agenda? Are the globalists, why are the elites so intent on flooding Europe and ultimately the United States too? I think Trump kind of put a stop to that temporarily, at least on a massive scale. But why are they doing this? Is it because the elites love Islam, or is there something else at work? What do you think, Dan?
Well, I think that there, of course, are so many reasons for why they do what they do, but I think one of the reasons is that they're basically putting troops on the ground. They're unleashing an invading army upon the Europeans, and Europeans and Westerners really provide the final obstacle for globalists in terms of them merging, all of governments and, basically limiting national sovereignty. Europeans on the ground who really oppose this, and Westerners at large, Americans, Australians, New Zealanders, they'd be the final hurdle in many ways to implementing this agenda. So basically, I think they're trying to overwhelm us with an invading army. And a lot of people will say, oh, well, there's only so and so amount of terror attacks per year, and you're more likely to die being hit by lightning than dying in a terror attack. And that could statistically be the case. However, these people change the texture of Western life, and they create such a fearful environment, especially in the cities, but now increasingly in the villages and the towns where they're placed. And that's really one of the most insidious side effects of importing these people from the third world, many of who have completely different standards about how they comport themselves and generally have a greater propensity towards crime and really heinous crimes, rapes of children, rapes of women, of course, beheadings, attacks. So, I mean, it goes far beyond the semi-occasional terror attack. It's a daily occurrence that is happening on the streets of Europe and the United States and Australia, where these people are really wreaking havoc. And I think that's really to the benefit of the globalists at this point.
Yeah, no, I agree with you 100%, Dan. And I think what's going to happen here as the natives become a minority in their own country, first in their own big cities, and then in their countries, people wake up and say, wait, why do we have a country called Sweden? Why do we have a country called Germany? I mean, it's just people from all over. We've all got different languages. We've got different religions. We've got different culture. We've got different history. In fact, we don't even like you guys. Let's just dissolve the borders, and we'll just all be one big globalist melting pot with no national identity whatsoever. We can all move into the so-called New World Order. And I think a perfect example of how the Islamists who are being imported into Europe are being used as a battering ram against liberty, just as I predicted years ago, is Macron's newly announced ban on homeschooling. Right? They said, oh well, Muslims might educate their kids at home, and so therefore nobody can educate their kids at home because Muslims might teach their kids to do jihad, and so now we've got to ban homeschooling. We've got to take over all private schools. I mean, it was so predictable. It was so obvious. Dan, you've made this now a big focus of your work. You're on the ground in Europe. I mean, what Europe is seeing now makes what America is seeing look minor by comparison. And of course, Latin American immigrants have a much more similar culture to the United States than, say, people from Egypt or Syria would have as it relates to European culture. But you have now launched a new operation. It's BorderHawk.News. Tell us a little bit about it. How do people find it? What should people expect to find there? And where are you going to go with it?
Yes, absolutely. So BorderHawk.News is the URL is BorderHawk.News, very easy to remember. It's a project that we've launched under the umbrella of an educational nonprofit organization called US Inc. And basically, their mission is to educate the general public inside the United States and abroad about the issues that are facing them as they pertain strictly to immigration and adjacent issues such as globalism, nationalism, conservation as well. And so they were seeking some new ways to reach to the public. And of course, the digital space is the most important one that we function in at this time, as opposed to hard copy newsletters or magazines, which are still effective, of course. But really, in order to reach a mass audience, you have to get onto the World Wide Web and onto social media or whatever is left of it at this point. So we launched this website. It's a single web page you can visit. And many of your viewers will, of course, be familiar with the Drudge Report, a news aggregation site that was, really pioneered this field. I know the Drudge has taken a decidedly different turn in recent months, and some are very dissatisfied with that direction. And I don't mean to compare us to them at all, but that gives some people a perspective as to what we do. And what we do is, on a daily basis, we aggregate news stories, specifically from the United States, but also from around the world, strictly about immigration and their impact on Western life. And so we present it all on a single page. We write really concise, clear headlines, whether the reports come from government reports, ICE reports, CBP reports, whether we're extracting nuggets out of mainstream media reports where they're not giving you the whole story. We give you the whole story right there in the headline so you know what to look for when you read those reports. We aggregate videos, reports from social media as well. And then we also have a side blog where we have bloggers who are contributing very valuable information as well. We put it all in one space where you can go on a daily basis and get a snapshot of what is going on in the world, specifically with immigration related issues. And what's interesting about this is, when I was brought on board to start this project, we have about 70 stories featured at any given time. And I said, I really hope that there will be enough content to keep the site looking fresh every day. And I am constantly amazed by the amount of stories that are collected by myself on a daily basis. I could basically refresh all 70 stories almost daily, because that's how much news there is. And so much of it is getting buried by the mainstream press. So our effort is to bring that in a very easy to digest format, and it's super sleek, and you can go there and then you can decide, based on the headlines, what story interests you, what would you like to read further about, and go and click and read that story in full. And so we provide that for people who maybe don't have enough time to be tracking down all the immigration-related stories. I'm sure very few people have that kind of time, so they can come and get an idea in a quick snapshot over the morning coffee, or sit down at night and really dig deeper into what we have to offer.
Yeah, excellent, Dan. Thank you. And guys, I really recommend you go check out the site. It's excellent, excellent stuff. Dan, in the last couple minutes we have left here, I just want to ask about your outlook. I've noticed, there is a massive and growing resistance among Europeans to what's happening. In fact, even the Chatham House, the Royal Institute for International Affairs, they released a poll, I think a couple of years ago, on the attitudes of Europeans toward this mass Islamic immigration. And even in the most pro mass immigration countries, it's just a tiny fringe minority that supports this. In fact, the overwhelming majority in every single country polled, including Germany, wants to stop to virtually all Islamic migration. But at the same time, Europe is, in my view, a civilization that's dying. The Europeans are not having enough children to even replace themselves. In fact, the next generation is going to be significantly smaller than this one. And they've given up so many of their liberties. I think the Swiss are a little island of maybe something different, right? They're not part of the EU. They've still kept a lot of their liberties. They've still got their firearms for the most part, although the EU is trying to undo that. But what is your outlook? I mean, I just last year or year before last, I went through Eastern Europe. I was in Hungary. I got to interview the minister or the Secretary of State there, and he said, you know what, we're going to stop this, even if it's just Hungary, but we're working with Poland and the Czech Republic. So in the East, it seems like there is more resistance, but of course we know that the communists never really went anywhere after the collapse. They just kind of renamed themselves, got new positions. What's your outlook on the future of Europe, on the future of the European nation states, on the future of the European Union? Is there enough resistance to stop the flood of migration? Is there enough opposition to revitalize European civilization, to restore the nation state? Is it all over? What do you think?
That's a great question. And I too have spent a lot of time in Eastern Europe, and it does give me hope being in places like Poland and Hungary and even the Czech as well, and to some degrees even Croatia and Montenegro. I mean, you still see a homogeneity that you don't see in Western Europe, and it gives me hope. While at the same time, the amount of pressure that is applied by the globalists, especially financially against against these countries, is just it's immense. So and also we realize, like you said, the communists never really went anywhere. So this current class of reasonably nationalistic politicians that are leading these countries, what happens when they're gone? Will they be replaced by equally competent leadership, or will they be replaced by people who are much more sympathetic to the globalist agenda, and that can be all undone basically overnight, the work that they've put in thus far. So that gives me a concern if they're going to be able to keep it going that way. But I do hope they do. And to speak to Switzerland, even in Switzerland, there is a rampant amount of immigration from the third world being allowed here, and refugees being welcomed into this country. So there is concern about what's going on in Switzerland as well. So in terms of Europe, I think we should look to what's going on in Eastern Europe as hopeful, but Europe in general, with its proximity to Africa and the rest of the third world via the conduits such as Turkey, really present a challenge. And if there isn't political will to actually remove many of the people who are here, let alone prevent more from coming, I do fear that the continent is in a state of decline. And so I think Americans would do well to watch what is going on here, because we're not far behind in the U.S. Some might argue are right alongside them in many ways with our own problems in the U.S. So I think that it's going to require a monumental effort to correct the damage that has been done in the past decades in Europe and in the U.S. And that effort will probably spawn monumental conflict on both continents if it is attempted. But it's the only answer at this point, in my opinion.
Excellent. Well, Dan, thank you so much for being with us. Thank you for the work that you're doing, folks. It's BorderHawk.News, and Dan is also the European Bureau Chief for Infowars.com. You can find a lot of his great articles there about what's going on, stuff that you will not find in the establishment media. Dan, thank you once again for being with us. Folks, thank you very much for watching. God bless you all.